Good evening, I'm John Rowland. This is the 10 o'clock news. You buy some candy or cigarettes in a vending machine, you eat at certain restaurants, or you go to see some sexy movies. And some of the money you're spending could be winding up in the mob's pockets. U.S. Attorney Ralph Giuliani says flatly, things cost a lot more in New York, and things are more unpleasant here because of what the Mafia does. Today, federal officials tried to start making the mob bosses do the paying. For the first time ever, the reputed heads of all 5 crime families in our town were hauled into court on one indictment. Bob O'Brien found Giuliani and the other top law officials smiling.
Great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the Mafia. This case charges more Mafia bosses in one indictment than any ever before.
Big Paul Castellano. According to lawmen, he's boss of the 800 gangsters who are said to make up the Gambino crime family. Castellano and the 4 other men fingered by the feds as godfathers of New York's 5 crime families, all indicted today. Castellano left the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan tonight after posting $2 million bail money. The 5 mob bosses are accused of running the Commission, said to be the ruling body of the most powerful organized crime elements in the entire nation. FBI Director William Webster says the Commission dominates the many families that make up La Cosa Nostra, or LCN.
We now know this much about the Commission, that it's a governing body separate and distinct from the individual LCN families, that illegal activities that cross family lines must have the Commission's approval, and that extends to their own in-house discipline, including hits and murders.
One of the murders the Commission supposedly okayed was the 1979 rob-out of Carmine Galenti, said to have been boss of the Bonanno family. Castellano's attorney, James LaRosa, says the feds will have to prove the Commission's existence.
I believe there's crime, and I believe that people bind together in it. Therefore, you can call out an organized crime. I don't believe there's a commission. I don't believe there's a La Casa Nostra, and it has to be proven to me, and it has to be proven to an American jury at one point.
The other alleged Mafia bosses indicted today are Antonio Tony Ducks Corallo, said to be head of the Lucchese crime family; Philip Rusty Rastelli, reputed head of the Bonanno crime family; Gennaro Jerry Lang Langella, identified by the indictment as acting boss of the Colombo family; and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the 74-year-old reputed don of the Genovese Mafia family. Salerno, too, made his bail of $2 million this evening. Preceded out of the courthouse by some younger protectors, Salerno faces possible sentences of up to 200 years in prison time if convicted. His attorney, Michael Rosen, calls the federal indictment something out of Alice in Wonderland.
This is a circus put on and orchestrated by the powers that be over there at St. Andrews Plaza.
Meaning the federal prosecutors?
That's what it means.
You say there's nothing to the federal government contention that...
We will address the charges in court. We were supposed to address them. We're not going to address them out on the street, and we're not going to address them in the press.
During today's bail hearing, federal prosecutors said thousands of hours of taped conversations had been recorded by the 90 wiretaps and 80 bugging devices used during the long investigation. U.S. Attorney Giuliani says the bugs, one of which was hidden by federal agents in the dashboard of Antonio Corallo's chauffeur-driven Jaguar, provide a vivid picture of how the American mob functions. Also in court today, Christopher Christy Tick Fernari, accused consigliere of the Lucchese family, and reputed Lucchese underboss Salvatore Tom Mick Santoro. Santoro's attorney Sam Dawson, pleading for low bail, told the court Santoro is suffering from cancer of the colon and should be in the hospital. Instead, both Santoro and Fernari are being held in lieu of $1,750,000 bail each.
My client was riding around in that car, and there wasn't one word that came out of his mouth that indicated any activity on his part of a criminal nature. A lot of good radio music, a lot of great radio music. And WINS News was played all the time, and one of the music stations was played all the time.
Maybe that's why.
Not all that much about criminal conduct, I'll tell you that.
U.S. Attorney Giuliani's description of the bail amount set here today, very solid, very reasonable. Giuliani says it may be as long as a year before this case goes to a jury. From Federal Courthouse on Foley Square, Bob O'Brien, Channel 5 News.
Also indicted today as a mafia leader was Agnello Della Croce. He's called the underboss of the Gambino family. Today's indictment also claims that a group of bosses operate a multi-million-dollar extortion racket in the concrete pouring business. The group is called the Club and may pick up money from businessmen in return for labor peace. Ralph Scarpo, the head of the Concrete Workers Union and a reputed mob member, was also indicted.
When President Reagan was elected, he promised to crack down on organized crime, and federal lawmen across the country have been working hard to flush them out of the woodwork, especially here in New York, where the alleged bosses of organized crime are on trial. Pablo Guzman reports.
But right now, we're just trying to select 12 people who haven't heard too much about this case. And that's about all there is to it.
What James LaRussa told us as he left federal court today was about as much as any attorney would say following the opening of the so-called commission trial. LaRussa is defending Christopher Fernari, 61, shown in the middle rear, alleged to be the consigliere of the Lucchese crime family. LaRussa would have been the attorney for another defendant in this case, Paul Castellano, alleged to have been the boss of the Gambino crime family. But LaRussa lost a client when, on December 16th, Castellano was assassinated outside a steakhouse. Law enforcement authorities believe the hit was carried out by Castellano's alleged successor, John Gotti, but only with the approval of the commission. According to federal officials, the Genovese crime family representative on the commission is 74-year-old Fat Tony Salerno. In court today, recovering from a minor eye operation. At one point, he fell asleep while lawyers huddled with Judge Richard Owens as a jury was being selected. Also defendants in this case are the two reputed top members of the Lucchese family, alleged boss Tony Dux Corallo, 73, and alleged underboss Salvatore Santoro, 70. From the Colombo family, the government alleges that reputed boss Carmine the Snake Persico, 52, sat on the commission. Persico is acting as his own lawyer in this case. And alleged underboss Jerry Langella, 47, is also a defendant. And on trial is an alleged Bonanno soldier, Anthony Bruno Indelicato, 30. Federal agents charge Indelicato was one of those responsible for the 1979 slaying of Carmine Galante. Most of the excused jurors that we talked to gave the expected length of the trial as their main reason for not wanting to be a part of the proceedings. Cedric McClester is a reporter who knows from the other side how juries on mob trials think. For 6 months, he was a juror in a case against Paul Castellano and other alleged Gambino members.
It could impact the jurors in a negative way. I mean, it could play against either side, depending on how the jurors take the exorbitant amount of time.
Alleged Bonanno boss Philip Rastelli was part of the original indictment, but he was severed until he completes a case in Brooklyn. According to the government, the commission dates back some 55 years to 1931, supposedly started by Lucky Luciano. When jury selection is completed, a process that could take a week or more, then the trial of the so-called mob commission will begin. And that case, together with that of the Gotti case in Brooklyn, are the ones that the government hopes will bring down the alleged leaders of 5 of the oldest organized crime factions in the United States. From the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, I'm Pablo Guzman, Channel 5 News.
Well, federal authorities believe the so-called commission trial just ended has won them a landmark victory in the fight against organized crime. But the fight isn't over. Len White reports.
When the 3 so-called godfathers and 5 underbosses were convicted yesterday of being members of a commission that ruled the Mafia, they were a part of history in the making.
We're winning the battle against organized crime. And it didn't happen overnight. This has been going on for over 25 years in identifying the people that are involved in organized crime. This is not an overnight phenomenon.
It was the RICO law that brought the crime bosses to justice. RICO standing for racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization. It officially makes belonging to the mob illegal. But will RICO prevent organized crime from doing business in the future?
The mob tactics will have to change. They will have to become more circumspect. They will have to stay out of crimes that are that makes them very vulnerable. They will not give up the criminal activity because they're built to make money. That's what it's all about.
Here at the federal court building in Brooklyn, there is another mob trial that is ongoing. At the core of this one, John Gotti, the head of the Gambino crime family. Gotti is on trial on charges of racketeering, charges that also come under the RICO law. His lawyers claim they are not worried about that, even given yesterday's crime commission conviction.
That has no effect upon our case. We have a different case. We are proceeding differently. Hopefully the jury will have a different verdict.
The John Gotti case is expected to continue here for at least 6 weeks. What happens in the case of La Cosa Nostra, beyond speculation, is still a mystery, ready now to unfold. Lynn White, Channel 5 News.
Tonight, 3 mafia bosses and 5 underlings are facing prison terms of up to 100 years for running the so-called commission that's directed organized crime since the days of Al Capone. Channel 5's Steve Dunlop reports from New York.
In the words of an FBI official, we've taken out their 300 hitters. The mob is on the run. 7 of the 8 commission defendants received 100-year prison terms and fines of $250,000 apiece. The 8th received a 40-year term and a $50,000 fine. and they all received an earful from the man who heard their case, federal judge Richard Owen. To Genevieve's boss, Fat Tony Salerno, Owen said, "There's a tape with you on it saying, 'I made the mob. If it weren't for me, there wouldn't be anything left.' The fact remains that you've spent your life feeding on this community with murders, beatings, and threats. To Tony Ducks Corallo, you've been the boss of the Lucchese family for a long, long, long time. You were prepared to kill somebody if they got in your way." Most of the defendants took it all without complaining. Lucchese underboss Paul Santoro said, "Just give me 100 years and get it over with." But Colombo chief Carmine Persico had the most to say. "I feel the prosecution should be on the stand," he intoned. "This case was prejudiced from the very first day." Afterwards, an attorney for one of the defendants agreed.
There was no physical harm to one single witness in this case. The two contractors that testified here, not even in the witness protection program, live at home in no danger, nobody's harmed them, and my client gets 100 years for a payoff case. He may deserve a few years in jail, but not 100 years.
100 years in prison, which hopefully means that they will never get out of prison, is the kind of sentence that should be handed out.
Steve Dunlop, Channel 5 News.